Welcome back to Random History. I'm your navigator as we delve into the little-known events and people that make history such an amazing subject. These are not the stories you would have heard about in school. In fact, if you did hear about them, you probably thought that they could not possibly be real. But they are. If you're a Gen Xer like I am, you probably spend a lot of time watching reruns of shows like Hogan's Heroes, where you were exposed to a comedic view of the French underground of World War II. But the resistance was not confined to occupied France. As we'll learn today, there were resistance groups throughout occupied Europe. Some the Allies openly supported, while others we pretty much ignored, or worse. In Yugoslavia, when the war began, we supported anyone that resisted. Unfortunately, traitors within the Allied intelligence community exerted a great deal of influence over Churchill and, through him, Roosevelt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get to the story. Today, we're diving into one of World War II's most audacious rescue operations. How the Yugoslav underground, led by General Draža Mihailović and his Chetnik forces, hid, protected, and guided hundreds of downed American airmen back to safety despite being deep inside Nazi-occupied territory. This is a story of Operation Halyard, a tale of unlikely alliances, makeshift airstrips, and unbreakable resolve. We'll explore the background, the heroes involved, and the human stories that bring it all to life. So stick around as we journey back to 1944 Serbia. First, let's set the scene. Yugoslavia was invaded by Axis forces in April of 1941. They crumbled in just 11 days. In that chaos, two main resistance groups emerged. The communist-led partisans under the leader Tito, and royalist Chetniks, loyal to the exiled Yugoslav king and commanded by Colonel, later General, Draža Mihailović. Mihailović, a seasoned officer from World War I, quickly organized guerrilla units in the rugged mountains of Serbia, focusing on sabotage against the Germans while waiting for an Allied invasion to fully liberate the country. His Chetniks numbered in the tens of thousands at their peak, operating as an underground network of fighters, villagers, and informants blended into the countryside. Unfortunately, British intelligence, under the leadership of members of the so-called Cambridge Five traitors, began feeding false information to Churchill that Mihailović was actually collaborating with the Germans. Churchill slowly began cutting off aid to the Chetniks as a result. By 1943, the U.S. 15th Air Force, based in Italy, ramped up their bombing raids on strategic targets like the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, a vital resource for the Nazi war machine. These missions were brutal. American B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses faced heavy flak and fighters, leading to hundreds of planes being shot down. Many crews bailed out over Yugoslavia, landing in a patchwork of territories controlled by Germans, Bulgarians, or local collaborators. For the airmen who survived the jump, the real fight began, evading capture in enemy territory. Romania's Ploesti oil complex was vast, spanning 19 square miles, with refineries like Astra-Romania and Concordia Vega. They were the linchpin of Axis oil production. It churned out millions of tons annually. Allied leaders at the Casablanca Conference prioritized crippling this supply as part of the broader oil campaign. The first U.S. strike came on 12 June 1942 via the Halverson Project, or HALPRO. 13 B-24 Liberator bombers, originally destined for China, but rerouted from Egypt under Colonel Harry Halverson, targeted Ploesti's Astra-Romania factory. Flying over neutral Turkey, they dropped bombs from medium altitude amid bad weather and poor navigation, causing minimal damage to the facility. Some bombs even landed in the Black Sea or nearby towns like Constanta. 3 civilians died in these raids, but the raid proved Ploesti's vulnerability. This alerted Axis defenses without really any significant disruption. The Axis response was swift. They fortified Ploesti into Europe's second most defended target, with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, smoke generators, and fighter squadrons from Germany, Romania, and Bulgaria, all tasked with defending the complex. Under Colonel Alfred Gerstenberg, they even hid guns in haystacks and rail cars. The big Allied push against Ploesti came in 1943 with Operation Tidal Wave on 1 August. It was a daring, low-level raid to evade radar and maximize destruction. It was planned by Colonel Jacob Smart, and it flipped Army-Air Force doctrine, sending 178 B-24s from 5 different bomb groups out of Benghazi, Libya, on a 2,400-mile round trip. Led by Brigadier General Uzal Ent, the bombers hugged the ground at 200 to 800 feet. They targeted 9 of the refineries, codenamed White 1 through 5, and then Red and Blue. Crews trained intensely in the desert, but chaos ensued. Clouds, scattered formations, navigation errors, like an early turn towards Bucharest, alerted air defenses, and the flight's radio silence prevented any kind of correction. Amid flak, flames, and fighters, they dropped over 500 tons of bombs with delayed fuses to ignite massive fires. Heroes emerged from this raid, like Colonel John Killer Kane, who pressed on despite extensive damage to his aircraft. Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes flew his plane, leaking fuel literally into the target. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded, the most for any single air action. Losses for the mission were brutal. 54 planes shot down, 310 airmen killed, 130 wounded, over 100 captured, and 78 interred in Turkey. Damage reduced output of the facility by 40 to 46%. But through Nazi slave labor, they restored full capacity within weeks. It became known as Black Sunday, and it was heroic, but strategically limited. The Allies would pause attacks on Ploesti for about 8 months, but with bases captured in Italy, the 15th Air Force relaunched its high-altitude raids beginning in April of 1944, under the leadership of Major General Nathan Twining. These strikes, often disguised as attacks on nearby rail yards, hammered Ploesti repeatedly through the summer. 24 missions with 5,600 bomber sorties and 900 RAF night runs, escorted by P-51 Mustangs and even P-38 Lightnings for surprise dives, they faced double defenses but inflicted heavy damage. Key raids included those on 5, 15, and 24 April, on both Ploesti and Bucharest. A June low-level attempt with P-38s was deemed too costly to repeat, and then 15 July with B-17s. Production of the facility plummeted by 44% in April alone, down to roughly 81,000 tons monthly by May. By 19 August, the refineries were destroyed, ceasing output before Soviet occupation came on 22 August. Losses totaled 222 bombers, but the campaign crippled Axis mobility. Tanks were idled, planes grounded. The Nazi war machine halted. Romanians, sensing defeat, freed POWs by late August, with daring rescues like Constantin Contrezino's flying a U.S. officer in a stolen Messerschmitt to coordinate evacuations. Enter Mihailović's Chetniks. Unlike the partisans who controlled more of the western regions, the Chetniks dominated eastern Serbia. They made it their mission to rescue these Allied flyers, viewing them as brothers in arms against the Axis. Local peasants and Chetnik scouts would spot parachutes, bury them to hide the evidence, and whisk the airmen to safe houses in villages or hidden mountain camps. The Chetniks provided food, medical care, clothing, often at great personal risk. In fact, the Germans offered bounties for captured airmen and executed anyone found helping them. One early example of the assistance from Mihailović came in January of 1944, when Chetnik units in Zlatibor and Toplica rescued crews from downed bombers, escorting them through treacherous terrain to Mihailović's headquarters near Pranjani. By spring, over 100 airmen were under Chetnik protection, hidden in barns, churches, and makeshift hospitals, without any initial Allied support. Mihailović personally directed these efforts, assigning his 1st Ravna Gora Corps to provide security and logistics. As historian Kirk Ford notes, the airmen's presence under Chetnik care proved Mihailović was, quote, well disposed towards the United States and was no collaborator, close quote. The Chetnik underground network was ingenious. They used couriers on horseback to move airmen between safe zones, taught them basic Serbian phrases for disguise, and even organized decoy operations to draw away German patrols. One airman recalled being fed cornbread and goat milk by villagers who risked everything. He said, quote, these people had nothing, but they gave us everything. The goal wasn't just hiding, it was guiding them back to Allied lines, but with no direct contact, that meant waiting for rescue. By July 1944, the situation was dire. Over 350 American bombers had been lost, with crews scattered across Serbia. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency, finally stepped in. Led by figures like George Vujnović in Bari, Italy, the OSS devised Operation Halyard, also called the Halyard Mission or Operation Airbridge. The plan: parachute a small OSS team into Chetnik territory to coordinate the evacuations. After several failed attempts due to bad weather and partisan interference because, well, communists are that evil, the team finally landed on the night of 2 August 1944 at Pranjani. Commanded by Lieutenant George Musilin, a tough Serbian-American football star turned OSS operative, the group included Master Sergeant Michael Rajacic and radio operator Arthur Jabilian. Musilin, by the way, I said he was a former football player. He was such a large man that the military actually had to change regulations so that he was allowed to parachute because he was considered too big to parachute. Anyway, he had previously served with Mihailović, and they linked up with the Chetniks immediately. Mihailović welcomed them, providing 8,000 fighters to secure the area against German attacks. The first challenge? Nothing major. Just build an airstrip without the Germans noticing. Under Captain Zvonimir Vukovic's oversight, Chetniks and local peasants worked at night, using ox-drawn plows and hand tools to level a 600-yard runway on a plateau in Pranjani. It was crude, no lights, no radar, but it worked. On 9 August, the first C-47 transports from the 15th Air Force landed under fighter escort. They evacuated 237 airmen in one shot. More airlifts followed, 210 on the 12th, 15th, and 18th of August. Others from satellite strips in Kocheljeva and Bozjanik through December. Mihailović's role was pivotal. He gathered airmen from across Serbia, ensured their safety during German sweeps, and even refused his own evacuation, saying, quote, I prefer to lose my life in my country than to live as an outcast in a strange land. His forces clashed with Germans and Bulgarians to protect the operations, like in March of 1944 near the city of Oplanik, where they repelled several attacks while escorting pilots. Who were the men the Chetniks helped save? Take Claire Musgrove. He was a B-24 ball turret gunner from Texas. It took him a while to get out of the ball turret, get his parachute on, and by the time he parachuted, the rest of his crew had been captured. Hiding in the woods, he was found by Chetnik scouts who buried his parachute and guided him through miles of forest to a village. A Chetnik interpreter recalled, the Germans were chasing parachutes with trucks and tanks. Musgrove was fed, clothed, and moved to Pranjani, where he joined hundreds awaiting rescue. When the C-47s arrived, he called it a tremendous thrill. Then there's Thomas Oliver, a navigator whose B-24 went down in April of 1944. He spent 96 days evading Nazis, guided by Chetnik guerrillas through ravines and villages. Oliver witnessed the Chetnik sacrifices, families sharing scarce food, fighters standing guard against patrols. Evacuated in August, he later testified to their heroism. Milton Friend, another airman downed in June of 44, shared his testimony years later. Chetniks protected him for weeks in Nazi-occupied Serbia, hiding him in hills and organizing his evacuation. He said, "They risked their lives for us," noting how they fought off German searches. There's Curtis Bud Dials from Ohio, who was rescued with his crew later, and he reflected, "My 15 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren would not be here if it weren't for the Serbs." These weren't isolated acts. In fact, over 500 airmen owed their lives to this network. The Chetniks treated them like family, sharing songs around campfires, teaching them card games to pass the time. Operation Halyard wrapped up on 27 December 1944, with 432 airmen and 80 other allies airlifted out. The largest rescue of U.S. airmen in history, but it wasn't without controversy. As I said earlier, the Chetniks faced accusations of collaborating with the Axis in some areas to fight the partisans, whom they saw for what they were, a communist threat. However, the rescues proved that anti-Nazi stance. As one source noted, there was absolutely nothing to be gained by turning American airmen over to the Germans. Partisans rescued more overall, about 2,000 versus 417 by the Chetniks, but Halyard was a Chetnik triumph. Unfortunately, post-war politics overshadowed the story. Mihailović was captured by Tito's forces, tried as a collaborator, and executed in 1946. The U.S. classified Halyard to avoid offending communist Yugoslavia, but in 1948, President Truman awarded Mihailović the Legion of Merit posthumously for his role, stating his forces were instrumental in obtaining the final Allied victory. It was presented to his daughter in 2005. Rescued airmen like Richard Feldman campaigned for decades to honor the Chetniks, forming groups and testifying. He said, "We will never forget." In the end, Operation Halyard reminds us that heroism often hides in the margins of history. Ordinary villagers and guerrillas risking all for strangers. Mihailović's underground didn't just hide and guide airmen, they restored faith in humanity amid war's horrors. As one airman put it, the Serbs, quote, "stood on the right side of history even when the world chose not to see it." The Ploesti raids were grueling for the planes and crews that flew them. I mentioned that the oil refineries were extremely important to the Nazi war effort. Because of that, they were a prime target for Allied command. Like most bomber missions during the war, the bomber groups took incredible losses each mission. From 1942 to 1945, nearly 6,000 sorties were flown in the Ploesti campaign alone. German air defenses, anti-air artillery, barrage balloons, and fighter defenses were so intense, the area became known as the Cauldron. In all, over 300 aircraft were shot down or damaged beyond repair, with between 3,000 and 4,000 killed, captured, or wounded. At least 80 men are still listed as missing in action. With the intensity of the combat in the Ploesti region, it should not come as a surprise that 6 men distinguished themselves and were awarded the Medal of Honor. 4 of the 6 received the award posthumously. Today, I'm going to tell you about one of the 2 that survived the action to continue the fight. Today, I bring you the gripping story of Colonel John Riley, Killer Kane, a man whose unyielding courage in the skies over Romania earned him our nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. Born on 5 January 1907 in McGregor, Texas, to a Baptist minister father, Kane grew up with a strong sense of duty. He attended Baylor University, where he excelled in zoology and German. He played varsity football and basketball and dreamed of becoming a doctor. But, as often happens, life took a different path. After a brief stint in medical school, he joined the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1932, earning his wings and rising through the ranks with a reputation for bold flying. By the time the World War II erupted, Kane was in the Mediterranean theater commanding the 98th Bombardment Group, nicknamed the Pyramiders. His aggressive tactics against German and Italian shipping caused their military intelligence units to dub him Killer Kane, a testament to his 43 combat missions and 250 hours in the air. In addition to the Medal of Honor that he would earn on 1 August 1943, he also earned a Silver Star for outmaneuvering a Messerschmitt 110. Let's pause here to set the stage. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill decided to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany's fuel supply, the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania. These facilities produced up to 60% of the Axis's crude oil, fueling Hitler's war machine. Destroying them could shorten the war by months. General Henry Hap Arnold tasked Colonel Jacob Smart in Washington with planning a daring low-level raid, flying at just between 200 and 800 feet above the ground, or AGL, in order to evade radar and allow gunners to fight back. This violated the standard Army doctrine of high-altitude bombing. It was risky for the slow, heavy B-24 Liberators. When he first heard of the plan, Kane didn't hold back. He reportedly called it the brainchild of, quote, some idiotic armchair warrior in Washington. This highlighted the dangers of the 2,400-mile round trip from Benghazi, Libya, over enemy territory to Ploesti and back. But duty called. He told his men, "We're going to knock out Ploesti or die trying." In fact, he was so convinced that the mission would fail or that he would be killed, he wrote goodbye letters to both his parents and his wife. On that fateful Sunday, forever known as Black Sunday in the Air Corps, 179 B-24s lifted off from Libya. Kane led the third element. His 98th Bomber Group with 47 planes, plus another 44 from the 389th. From the start, chaos reigned. One bomber crashed on takeoff, another ditched in the Mediterranean. Kane, prioritizing fuel conservation, flew at safer, lower power settings, falling well behind the lead groups. Over the Balkans, dense clouds scattered the formation. Kane's group emerged 20 minutes late, but still they pressed on, refusing to abort this vital mission. The Germans, well, they were ready. Having cracked U.S. codes, they bolstered their defenses. 3 fighter groups, Romanian and Bulgarian planes, hidden anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, smoke pots. It truly did earn its name, the Cauldron. As Kane's formation approached the initial point at Ploesti, they turned southeast along the railroad line and flew straight into hell. Kane piloted his B-24, called Hail Columbia, into a maelstrom. The lead groups had already struck, but a navigation error by Colonel Keith Compton set them off course, hitting the wrong targets and alerting every gun in the region. Flames towered 50 feet above the planes. Black smoke choked the crews and hampered visibility. Kane found his assigned target, the Romania refinery, codenamed White 4, already ablaze. Instead of turning back, he redirected his formation deeper into the inferno, bombing through smoke on instruments alone. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from a disguised flak train, the Europa, the Caterpillar, raking the low-flying bombers. Junkers, Ju-88s, and Messerschmitts Me-110s swarmed the flight. Kane's gunners fought back, but Hail Columbia took 20 hits. An engine lost, fuselage riddled, wing spar bent, propeller damaged. Flames licked through the open bomb bay. It was a rough show, Kane later said. Above us and around us were Ju-88s and Me-110s. Our guns wouldn't work. We had shot them all out, going into the target. raising hell with the ack-ack batteries and the machine gun nests. Despite the damage, Kane circled the target to assess the destruction, then led his surviving planes home. To save fuel, he ordered his plane to jettison everything non-essential: empty Bombay tanks, damaged guns, tools, even heavy flight clothes, keeping only food, water, and ammo. After a grueling 14 hours and 40 minutes, Hail Columbia crash-landed in Cyprus, its crew miraculously still alive. Operation Tidal Wave was costly. 54 planes lost, 532 airmen dead or missing, 40% of Pulesti's capacity temporarily knocked out. As I mentioned earlier, the Nazis used slave labor to quickly put the refineries back online. Yet, it was one of the most decorated U.S. air missions ever. 5 Medals of Honor, including Kane's. Kane's official citation reads, quote, "For conspicuous gallantry in action and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, by his gallant courage, brilliant leadership, and superior flying skill, he and the formation under his command successfully attacked the vast refinery so essentially to our enemy's effort." Close quote. He received the award on 4 September 1943 in Cairo, along with the Air Corps' Legion of Merit. After the war, Kane commanded bases in the U.S. and abroad, finally retiring as a colonel in 1954. He built his home on a farm in Arkansas, where he lived a quiet life until he moved to Pennsylvania to be near family. Near the end of his life, he would reflect, quote, "I still recall the smoke, fire, and the B-24s going down like it was yesterday. Even now, I get a lump in my throat when I think about what we went through." Colonel Kane died in 1996 and was buried in full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. Since his death, Kane has been honored by the 93rd Bomb Squadron by having their combat crew training school named after him. His alma mater, Baylor University, also honored him by placing a statue of him outside their football stadium. Like so many of the heroes I've talked about in this series, Colonel Kane was dedicated to the military ethos: duty, honor, country. Kane's story, like all our Medal of Honor recipients, reminds us that true heroes do not seek glory. They answer the call, no matter the cost. This brings us to the end of another episode of Random History. I hope you enjoyed it and will, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. You can also click on the link and leave us a comment, send us an email, or give me an idea for a future episode. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, as always, I'd like to thank you, the listeners, and my incredible wife for the support and inspiration for this podcast. So until next time, make some history of your own. Navigator out.